Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased with this turnout. You know, I am a Marcel Duchamp scholar, and there's about 8 of us in the world, and we normally talk to each other in rooms that are pretty empty. You can sort of see that sagebrush just rolling down the floors. But I'm thrilled with the turnout, and I've got an entertaining lecture for you that is also full, hopefully, of insights into Duchamp's work. Now, the reason for this lecture is the Hood Museum recently acquired a box in a valise by Duchamp, arguably one of the greatest works of art of the 20th century. And I wanted to, before you see it in the galleries and have to deal with its esoteric contents, I wanted to give you some baggage, you know, so you could approach it. And as I said, I think that for us, when we were thinking about acquisitions when I started, I talked with the curators and my senior staff, and we were very concerned about the underrepresentation of women in the collection. And we were very lucky to acquire at auction a painting by Angelica Kaufman that I think is going to be a big boost for us. And it seemed to me we had this wonderful collection of Fluxus. And the Fluxus artists were the followers of Duchamp in the 1960s, and they made their own boxes called Flux Kits, and I'll be showing some of those to you at the end of the talk. And I thought, this is the connecting tissue. Get the box and valise in the collection, and those will come to life too. So I'm going to talk for probably about 40 minutes. We'll have some questions. We can go up to the galleries and look at the new piece. And there's also a wonderful exhibition called The Expanding Grid. And it was a project that was designed by 30 students in the studio art department under the auspices of Brenda Garand. And we worked with a number of faculty members. And what was terrific about it was that they chose the works and they designed the space that they're in. And I think the results are extraordinary. So you'll see that upstairs too. And there's a reception in Kim Gallery for those of you like me who like a glass of wine. Okay, we're going to get going. Can we have the lights down, please? Marcel Duchamp described his boîte and valise as a portable museum that would allow him to carry around his life's work in a traveling box. The artist spent 6 years, between 1935 and 1941, recreating his oeuvre in miniature using an elaborate and, at that time, virtually obsolete technique known as pochoir, which allows the colors to be precisely applied to multiple impressions of the same black and white reproduction by means of stencils. These accurate facsimiles, show you here, of the artist's early paintings and drawings, as well as the diminutive models of 3 of his ready-mades. So you have at the top, this is Air de Paris. It's a ampoule from a chemist shop. And Duchamp was in Paris, he was returning to America, and he had a friend called Walter Arensberg. And so he had the chemist break the file, fill it with Paris air, and seal it. Very simple idea. Duchamp's ideas are always very simple. This is a typewriter cover called Underwood. And this is the notorious Fountain, a men's urinal that he submitted to an exhibition. And of course, it was censored. And what you have to understand is that all of these things are about that big. This is like a doll's house. So 3 of the ready-mades, and these provided the source material for the first edition of the work, which was issued in 1941 in a series of 20 deluxe boxes. So this is one of the 20. The works in the deluxe edition consist of a plywood box fitted inside a leather-covered suitcase or valise with a carrying handle. Now, Duchamp commissioned a joiner in Paris to create the wooden components using his own designs, and this is one of the drawings that he did for the work, including the guide rails for the 2 slide pulling outs and the wooden strips which make up the monogram M for Marcel. This project is nothing if not an autobiography. Each box in the deluxe edition also contained an original work of art mounted on the inside of the lid, in addition to the 68 standard reproductions of Duchamp's most significant works. And you can see in this image on the far side, this is the original work of art. There are these chess pieces that he designed and then put in a map of the United States. Here's another one, the drawing Hand Reflection. And what's interesting about this is that some collectors had no idea about what was a reproduction and what was original. So, you know, for years, these people, I should tell you who they are. They're Alain and Henri Oppenau. They were Swiss friends of the artist. Nothing to do with the art world. You know, never really were collectors. They just got this as a gift for Christmas one year. And when they were told at the end of their lives, oh, I see you have a great Duchamp drawing, they said, yes, isn't it great? He reproduced all his work. And the dealer who spoke to them said, no, that's the real thing. That's the real deal. The artist would spend the rest of his life assembling 6 further editions, each slightly different from the other, which make up the standard edition of 300 boxes that were periodically distributed in small batches during the last 3 decades of his lifetime. Eventually, Duchamp grew tired of the repetitive and time-consuming nature of the project and hired assistants to help him complete the set. These assistants included Xenia Cage, the wife of John Cage and a wonderful collage artist in her own right, as well as Joseph Cornell, who would later become famous for his own box constructions. And Cornell's boxes often include references to the work of his friend and mentor, as seen in the discs found in the Woodpecker Habitat series that recycled materials that Duchamp had discarded from his earlier experiments with rotating discs. Now, these discs in this box, and obviously the scale is off. This is quite a small work. It looks huge. Duchamp designed these discs for a toy that he wanted to sell in Macy's department store. And Macy's were originally interested, but they couldn't agree on the price. And Duchamp put these in the trash. And we know that Cornell, in a later interview, said that he retrieved these discs from the trash and put them in his work. And Duchamp came to one of his openings, and he said, those look very familiar to me. You know, where did you get them? And we did a wonderful exhibition in Philadelphia. It was called Duchamp Cornell in Residence. And we found all sorts of examples. Whenever you see, I don't know if you noticed that earlier piece. In fact, I should probably go back to it. This drawing, for example, where, can you see, this is actually torn. It's like a collage. So he tore the paper to give this map of the United States. So the other side, the part that he threw away, turns up in a Cornell box. You know, this is the sort of thing we're dealing with. But he was a great assistant, and Joseph Cornell made basically, I would say, something like 75 boxes. And then he made his own boxes, which were, very different. So this is the work that the Hood Museum has acquired. It's from the final edition of the box in a valise. It's known to scholars as Series F. You gotta love these scholars like me. We minutely document the differences between each series with our little rulers. This is Series F, which Duchamp completed in 1966. And obviously, this is upstairs on the second floor. I invite you to see it after the talk. We made a huge vitrine to show it in, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Housed in a red leather box the size of a large attaché case and assembled with the help of the artist's stepdaughter, Jacqueline Matisse Monnier, the works in Series F are the most sought after by museums and collectors, since they represent Duchamp's final statement on the theme of the portable museum. In addition to the 68 standard reproductions, these series include 12 additional works. Now, one of them you see here, this is the Wedge of Chastity. Duchamp got married in 1954 to Tini Sattler. She had been married to the art dealer Pierre Matisse. And he gave her, as a wedding present, a thick wedge of bronze that was stuck inside a gummy piece of dental plastic. She carried it around in her purse. I met her. For the rest of her life, she had that in her purse. And this is one of my favorites. This is Objet d'Art. Now, this looks like a penis. I don't think there's any doubt about that, right? It's a vein, detumescent penis. And Duchamp surprised, really, everyone by revealing that it's actually, it was used to make a cast of a female breast. And Bob Gober once explained to me that casting a female breast is the most difficult thing you can ever do if you're used to doing body casts, because it's just, you know, such a soft, pliable area of the body. And so it's like a brace, and you can imagine it being filled up. But what Duchamp loved was that it signified something else. And all of his life, he was interested in this breaking down barriers. You know, gender indeterminacy was something he absolutely adored, as well as the art world. I mean, his work, basically after 1912, was taking on tradition and turning it over. And he was such a radical avant-garde artist, and I think that's why everyone still looks at his work today. So this is one of a series, along with The Wedge of Chastity, of erotic objects that he had issued in the 1950s with virtually no explanation. It was another 15 years before he actually started speaking about what these things were. And people just, you know, you can imagine the imagination ran away with them. And it's interesting, for these works that are reproduced in this series, he actually used color photography. Color photography had advanced to the stage that it had caught up with that pochoir technique that he'd been using. Okay. It seems clear from the correspondence that Duchamp's original intention in the Valise project was to create something akin to a catalogue raisonné with color reproductions and explanatory text. On March the 5th, 1935, just a few months after publishing the Green Box Notes, Duchamp told Catherine Dreyer that he was considering making an album of approximately all the things I produced. The fact that Duchamp was planning a catalogue raisonné of his work in the mid-1930s is surprising, given his Dadaist beliefs, as well as his notoriously meager artistic output. Even his longtime friend, Walter Arensberg, who prided himself on understanding even the most esoteric of the artist's works, was perplexed by the autobiographical nature of the Valise, while also recognizing the uniqueness of the project. And this is Arensberg. It has been difficult to know exactly what to say of such an epitome of a life's work, he wrote to Duchamp on May 21st, 1943. You have invented a new kind of autobiography. It is a kind of autobiography in a performance of marionettes. You have become the puppeteer of your past, end quote. Unlike many of his contemporaries, including Pablo Picasso, Fernand Léger, and Henri Matisse, who by this time had created a prodigious number of paintings, Duchamp had deliberately limited his artistic production to a handful of key works. In doing so, Duchamp believed that he could avoid repeating himself, which he argued had been the sad fate of so many successful painters in the modern era. The Valise can thus be seen as a self-deprecated joke, with an undertone of criticism for the excesses of his fellow artists, which allowed Duchamp to proudly claim that his own oeuvre was so small that he could fit all of his art objects into a small suitcase. There is also the possibility that the artist initially intended his album as a humorous parody of the comprehensive catalogue raisonné of Picasso's work that Christian Zervos began in 1932. The monumental task of documenting Picasso's work throughout his lifetime, the Spanish-born artist would live another 40 years, and the catalogue raisonné would eventually number 33 volumes, as you see here, was widely publicized at the time, especially after Picasso decided to aid Zervos by signing each painting with the exact date of its completion. Long suspicious of the notion of the artist's genius, Duchamp was rather scornful in his comments to the press about the Zervos catalogue raisonné, which smacked to him of narcissism and careerism. In a television interview with James Johnson Sweeney that aired on NBC in 1956, Duchamp explained his reasons for making a comprehensive anthology of his own works, as well as its shift from book form to portable museum. It was a new form of expression for me. Instead of painting something, the idea was to reproduce the paintings that I love so much in miniature. I didn't know how to do it. I thought of a book, but I didn't like that idea. Then I thought of the idea of a box in which all of my works would be mounted like in a small museum. And here it is in this valise, end quote. At a time when no art museum would honor Duchamp with a retrospective, the artist decided, in effect, to be his own curator, organizing a self-contained traveling exhibition of his life's work that could be changed at will simply by rearranging the contents of the box. And I should point out that every one of these kind of loose black folders, if you turn it over, has another image. So essentially, you can keep remaking and playing with this endlessly. There's an endless cycle of repetitions possible. Why the artist should want to faithfully reproduce the highlights of his artistic career in miniature and pack them into a small suitcase has been the subject of great discussion since the first bottom valise appeared in 1941. Benjamin Buchloh, who was offered the most convincing reading of the work to date, views it as representing Duchamp's attempt to critically address the institutionalization of the avant-garde, meaning the process of acculturation by which the transgressive artistic practices of the early 20th century came to be officially validated, categorized historically and stylistically, reproduced and commodified, and consequently domesticated and defanged by museums and art galleries. The bottom valise reconstructs this system only to parody it by self-administering the institutional acculturation of the work, as well as its reification in the commercial art market. The museum layout, the reproduced status of the artworks, and their curatorial and pedagogical presentation, with each artwork being clearly catalogued and identified in terms of title, date, and collection. And I hope you can see that. He basically did museum labels for everything. These all speak to an historical awareness of a specific reformulation of the art museum in the 1930s. And you just have to think of MoMA, which opened in 1929. And Duchamp was very upset with MoMA because it billed itself as the first museum of modern art. Well, Duchamp had founded with Catherine Dreyer and Man Ray the Société Anonyme, which they claim was the first modern art museum in America in 1921. And whereas they saw their work as being very much against this kind of cataloging and isms, describing everything through isms, when Art News turned 60, Duchamp sent a cable to the editor saying, "Congratulations on 60 ism-packed years." So, to him, MoMA was all about this explaining of the avant-garde that he felt was the wrong way to go. So Buchloh's idea is that this is just all parody, and we'll come back to that. Duchamp conceptualized his portable museum at the same time that André Malraux was rethinking his own, and there are numerous similarities between the two projects. After reading Walter Benjamin's seminal 1936 article on art in the age of mechanical reproduction, Malraux began to consider the promising possibilities of transforming the museum from a geographically determined collection of original art objects, traditionally organized by national schools, as in the Louvre, into a virtual display of cross-referenced photographic reproductions, much like Google Images today. This new model represents a post-national and post-architectural museum, since the images would be free-floating rather than held down through semi-permanent collection displays. Malraux's Museum Without Walls, that's right, that's how it translates. Malraux's, I guess we'll say the Museum Without Walls, as it came to be known, uprooted works of art from their historical, geographical, or temporal context and reorganized them along purely stylistic grounds. In one memorable instance, for example, he compared a photograph of an angel's head from Reims Cathedral to another of a sculpted Buddha from 4th century Gandhara. As a result, artistic identity is subsumed under a metaphysics of style. As T.J. Demos has argued, Duchamp's bottom valise shares Malraux's system of miniaturized reproductions that have been decontextualized from any historical context. As a mobile museum of color reproductions contained inside a leather valise, Duchamp's box is thus an idiosyncratic reenactment of Malraux's Museum Without Walls. The major difference, however, is that Duchamp's museum stages a monographic retrospective exhibition, something that Malraux's model dispenses with in favor of thematic displays that trace cross-cultural and trans-historical stylistic developments. Duchamp's willingness to reproduce his works in miniature may have stemmed from his belief that there was nothing inherently sacred about a work of art, and that the idea behind an art object was more important than the object itself. The obsessive attention to detail that one finds in the production of the boxes also suggests a concern to preserve the past, while simultaneously keeping his ideas alive for new generations of artists. The Bourdin Valise project began in the spring of 1935, at a time when Duchamp was preparing to restore the Bride Strip Bear by her bachelor's even, otherwise known as the large glass, which had been badly damaged following its first public exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum of Art in 1926. This is one of the few photographs of this work known, and if you can read this dedication, it was from Marcel Duchamp to Joseph Cornell at the time that Cornell was making the boxes. The large glass was returned to its owner, Catherine Dreyer, in a flatbed truck. Bouncing along the rural Connecticut roads, imagine that, two enormous panes of glass. This work is 9 feet high. Bouncing along these roads to her home in West Reading, Connecticut, the two enormous panes of glass shattered, and it took Dreyer another 4 years to summon the courage to inform Duchamp that his magnum opus, which he had worked on from 1912 to 1923, was now completely in pieces. The artist decided to laboriously glue the broken shards back together and recreate the sections that were beyond repair, which required him to revisit the handwritten notes and diagrams that had prepared the way for the large glass. In October 1934, Duchamp published 94 of these notes in facsimile form in a limited edition box set, known to posterity as the Green Box, due to the color of the felt-covered cardboard box that houses the notes and diagrams. And you can see these have no order. There's an absolute randomness to the nature of this. You can just, like the Bourdin Valise, you can just put it together any way you want. The notes published in the Green Box provided an indispensable guide to the genesis, construction, and the meaning of the work, which could now be understood as an allegory of frustrated desire. They also helped Duchamp to lovingly conserve and stabilize the large glass over the course of 2 months during the summer of 1936, when he worked daily on the task of carefully gathering the shattered glass fragments and fixing them back in their original position. "It's a job, I tell you," he told a local journalist, "but fun, like doing a jigsaw puzzle, only worse." Duchamp completed his repair of the large glass by sandwiching the entire assembly between 2 additional plates of glass, which he mounted in a metal frame and installed in the library of Catherine Dreyer's Connecticut home. And here they are together at the end of that 2-month stint. The large glass is now back on view. He also took advantage of his close proximity to the work to recreate this huge painting on glass in the Bourdin Valise, using transparent celluloid instead of glass, which I don't have to tell you would have broken over time because of the portable nature of this. He didn't want to ever have this again. So this is this very sort of lovely celluloid that you see through, and you'll see it upstairs, and he recreated the mallet molds using the same technique. Upon his return to Europe in September 1936, Duchamp wrote to Dreyer that repairing the large glass had been, quote, "a wonderful vacation in my past life, a vacation in past time instead of a new era." And I would argue that he continues this vacation in past time when he gets back to Paris, and he having seen his works in the United States. I think part of the reason he went to Dreyer to recreate the large glass was to also see his works. He wanted to make color notes. Then he could go back to Paris and really begin the serious work of recreating them. So it's surely no coincidence that Duchamp began making preparations for the Bourdin Valise in the immediate aftermath of both the publication of the Green Box and the painstaking reconstruction of the large glass. And I'll just give you one example here of the sort of color notes that he took while he was in the States. So this is Apollinaire enameled. You probably know this piece. It was an advertisement for Sapelin enamel. So imagine an S there. And he created a sort of bar so he could make a pun on his friend Apollinaire, the great poet. And it's a little girl painting a bed. And he put I don't know if you can see this, he drew a reflection of her hair. But it's a very minimal intervention to what was basically a sign in a painter's shop. It's what they call an assisted ready-made. And then you look at the color notes and all of these kind of splashy colors, because he really wants to recreate them, and using the most up-to-date way of doing it. Now, all of these projects So the green box, the Bourdin Valise, and the reconstruction of the large glass, to me, share an interest in the replication and preservation of works of a fragile and ephemeral nature that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed. They also reflect Duchamp's thinking about the facsimile and the nature of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, to borrow the title of Walter Benjamin's famous 1936 essay. As I shall argue, Duchamp's Bourdin Valise venture offers a powerful commentary on and counterpoint to Benjamin's writings about the aura of a work of art and its loss in an age of photography and film, which as we have seen, directly inspired André Malraux's notion of a museum without walls. According to Benjamin, photography and film represented a crisis for painting, which, as an object for contemplative immersion, cannot tolerate mass viewing conditions. The endless reproduction of works of art would inevitably destroy their authority, since the changes in human perception that necessarily happen when technology represents reality in different ways would ensure that paintings would become ubiquitous, ephemeral, and ultimately valueless. Benjamin analyzed Dada montage and film, which both have an intentionally jarring and violent impact on the senses of the viewer that denies any form of associative thought or contemplation. However, there is an ambivalence in Benjamin's writings about the aura of a work of art, whose meaning is not entirely clear. On the one hand, its loss is celebrated as the end of the exclusive ritual status of an art object, which previously belonged in the privileged domain of the wealthy private collector or museum, in favor of a popular mass audience that now has unprecedented access to works of art through photography, postcards, and other forms of mechanical reproduction. Yet on the other, Benjamin mourns the disappearance of aesthetic experience of a unique and unrepeatable kind that he felt would be the inevitable result of the mass reproductions of paintings. He never really explains what the aura is for the artwork. He gives, as an analogy, the idea of being in the countryside and seeing a mountain or the branch of a tree, and that idea of contemplative immersion is very important. And I think it relates to a lot of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and the idea of the Stimmung. I think for him, the aura was a sort of sensibility that could be lost through endless repetition. Unlike Benjamin, however, Duchamp refused to believe that the work of art was capable of having an aura. And his rejection of painting in favor of film and photography during the Dada era was a direct result of his loss of faith that any kind of aesthetic contemplation was possible, especially the kind that Benjamin yearned for. He just saw it as a kind of doomed nostalgic romanticism for something that never existed. When asked why he quit painting in 1918, Duchamp responded pointedly, "My attitude towards art is that of an atheist towards religion. I would rather be shot or kill myself than paint again." That's a bit extreme. Like Benjamin, however, Duchamp recognized that the art object would have a different presence in an age of mechanical reproduction, and that it would take value from something other than mimesis in the traditional sense. Duchamp thus embraced the facsimile and the copy at the very moment that Benjamin was lamenting their role in diminishing the aura of the work of art. It should be pointed out that Duchamp could have used faster reproduction techniques, such as offset lithography, to make the facsimiles of his works in the Bourdin Valise, but chose instead to use an incredibly laborious printing technique that gave him, however, a far superior degree of exactitude in terms of color. After obtaining black and white photographs of all the paintings and works on paper that he wanted to reproduce in the Bourdin Valise, Duchamp traveled to see each work in person, making detailed notations on their colors and execution. He then began making batches of color-type reproductions that were printed in monochrome on very large sheets of paper. Duchamp added the necessary colors to these black and white images based on his color notes as well as his memory of creating the originals. From these hand-colored reproductions, the highly skilled craftsmen that worked with Duchamp at the Pochoir studio in Paris prepared a series of watercolors that served to establish the necessary sequence of colors and thus the number of stencils required for each work. Then, for each individual shade, a proof was pasted onto zinc foil, and the parts to be colored were cut out of the proof and the foil with a special knife, before the color was applied with a flat brush. As Eke Bonk has noted, it took around 8 weeks to obtain a satisfactory image using this process. On average, each work reproduced in the bottom valise, so such as these, each work contains about 30 individual colors, all applied by hand through stencils and then color corrected by Duchamp, who would reject several proofs before reaching the exact hue that he felt most accurately reproduced the original color in each painting. Unimaginable as this may seem today, this meticulous process, which took 6 years to complete, gave Duchamp the result he desired, namely a series of miniature facsimiles of his most important works that precisely replicated their colors. Multiple in number, yet singular in appearance, these paradoxical works transcend the facile mechanical replication of images through their fetishistic attachment to the colors of the original. No mechanical process had yet been invented that could rival the outstanding quality of the colors in these uncanny simulacra. Yet the sheer scale of the project, for which the artist created some 23,000 reproductions, would have been impossible to have been conceived before the age of mechanical reproduction. The concept of mass reproduction thus becomes for Duchamp a new way of thinking about the work of art. Rejecting Benjamin's notion that the importance of an object is based on its singular identity, its uniqueness, its originality, Duchamp instead celebrates the plurality of copies available through mass reproduction as the most salient and pervasive manifestation of modernity. The artist delighted in the fact that the Bourdon Valise was not recognized as a work of art when it first appeared in the early 1940s, and was even regarded as proof that he had ceased to be an artist. Basically, no critic could accept this as a work of art. It was either described as a print edition, and that happened, or it was seen as some sort of joke. You know, they had no critical language with which to engage this. Holding on to the notion of the erratic original artwork, critics simply had no vocabulary with which to deal with these works, which offered a profound challenge to the accepted codes and practices of art making as they were understood at the time. Duchamp even submitted works related to the Bourdon Valise to the 1940 International Exhibition of Surrealism in Mexico City, where they were once again ignored by the critics. And this is one of the things I discovered, actually to my horror in doing the research for this lecture, is that when we, as scholars, look at the catalogue raisonné and we think, oh, the nude descending was shown in Mexico City. It wasn't the nude descending. It was one of these. And so a lot of the exhibition histories now have to come under scrutiny. I found that in a letter to Breton, and it's one of those discoveries that gives you a migraine. It means you've got a lot of work to do. Ironically, the only person to validate these works as works of art rather than mere reproductions was Walter Benjamin, who noted their strange attraction in his diary in the late spring of 1937. Saw Duchamp this morning, he wrote. Same cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. Showed me his painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, in a reduced format, colored by hand en pochoir. Breathtakingly beautiful. Maybe mention, end quote. Benjamin clearly recognized that Duchamp had managed to blur the boundaries between the unique art object and the multiple in this work, whose breathtaking beauty, derived from the pochoir method of applying colors, reinstated the aura into a mechanically reproduced work of art. And I think this is why the maybe mention point is interesting. Did Benjamin think of revising that essay? I would also mention here, you've probably noticed, this is a notarized postage stamp. This is how a notary would authenticate a work of art. Duchamp had a public notary authenticate a replica. This is all part of the parody. It was not until 1941 that Duchamp began to use the term Bourdon Valise, and his decision to place his works inside a leather suitcase was almost certainly informed by his personal circumstances during the Second World War. The German occupation of Paris that began in June 1940 meant that Duchamp was unable to travel freely through the occupied zone to obtain materials for his boxes, much of which came from suppliers outside Paris, especially in the south of France. I thought of a scheme, he later recalled. I had a friend, Gustave Candel, who was a wholesale cheese merchant in La Salle, and I asked him if he could commission me to go and buy cheese for him in the unoccupied sector. Now, I'm going to break this quote by saying Gustave Candel is one of Duchamp's great childhood friends, and this is the portrait he made of his mother in 1912. It's his Redon phase, very short-lived, only one painting. This painting horrified the mother. Horrified. She really, she thought she'd been impaled or something. And it led to a bit of a rift between the two, but it's a great work. That has nothing to do with this quote, but I'm just going to leave it on the screen. Okay. So, Gustave Candel, who was a wholesale cheese merchant in La Salle, and I asked him if he could commission me to go and buy cheese for him in the unoccupied sector. Candel gave me a letter, which I took to the German authorities, and with that letter and a bribe of 1,200 francs, I got from a secretary that famous little red card called an Ausweis, which allowed me to travel by train from Paris to Marseille. I thought I had to be very careful and buy cheese, and probably give an account of my expenses when I crossed the border between the two zones, but the Germans never asked me any questions, end quote. In the newly conceived one in Valise, the artist's works are reproduced on a Lilliputian scale and cleverly arranged inside the box like a traveling salesman's wares, thus mirroring his own efforts to gather much-needed paper and other materials for his project, which were hidden under the cheese samples inside a leather valise. This is the whole key to why he shifts from a book, that early autobiography, the book, the anthology, the album, into a leather suitcase. He leaves out the cheese, but that's another thing. In the spring of 1941, Duchamp used his travel permit as a cheese merchant to make 3 trips to Marseille, where he picked up enough supplies for around 50 boxes that he planned to assemble in the United States. Duchamp brought them to Grenoble and shipped them as household effects with Peggy Guggenheim's art collection to New York, where he would join them in May 1942 after spending nearly a year obtaining the necessary travel permits. However, there is a poignant historical correspondence between the fate of Duchamp, who was able to cross Nazi checkpoints without drawing attention to his artistic identity, and that of Walter Benjamin, who escaped Paris on June 13th, 1940, the day before the German army entered the city, but not before placing a copy of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction in the Bibliothèque Nationale for safekeeping. Benjamin had been living in Paris as a refugee since 1933, when, endangered as a Jewish intellectual, he escaped Germany after the Nazis seized power. The Gestapo had issued an arrest warrant for him in the late 1930s, so he was absolutely terrified of this moment. Benjamin arrived in Marseille in mid-September 1940, where Max Horkheimer had arranged to have an emergency exit visa waiting for him at the United States consulate. Unfortunately, Benjamin had failed to obtain a French exit visa, newly required by the collaborationist Vichy regime, which was relentlessly purging its enemies of the state at that time. After anxiously waiting for several days without being able to secure the necessary travel permits, Benjamin took a train to the countryside near the Spanish border, and from there, out of sheer desperation, decided to make the harrowing crossing through the Pyrenees Mountains with a small group of refugees and enter Spain illegally. Because of a heart condition, he could only walk for 10 minutes at a time and then stop for one. Yet he refused to let anyone help him or even carry his black leather briefcase, which contained, he said, a new manuscript that was more important than I am. After arriving in the Spanish border town of Port-Bou, Benjamin was informed that he would not be admitted into the country without the outstanding French exit visa and was to be sent back the following morning to the German authorities in occupied France. Unwilling to accept this fate, he committed suicide in his hotel room on September the 26th, 1940. He was just 48 years old. Soon afterwards, his leather briefcase was handed over to a court in Figueras, although the contents, including this new manuscript, later went missing and have never been recovered. So I hope that, like me, you'll pause a moment this evening as you look into Duchamp's fabulous suitcase, obsessively filled with reproductions of his life's work, and think of Benjamin's empty leather briefcase and the tragic loss of one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. So to conclude then, we have seen how Duchamp's concept of the portable museum intersects with and responds to Walter Benjamin's ideas about the changing status of art in the age of mass reproduction, and André Malraux's thoughts about art as an assembly of meaning informed by different voices across time and place. Whether by coincidence or design, Duchamp, Benjamin, and Malraux, all of whom were working in Paris in the mid-1930s, were simultaneously exploring the reproduction, transformation, and distribution of images at a time when film, media, posters, photography, and technology were transforming the culture and environment of the city in which they lived. Since Duchamp's own death in October 1968, the meaning and significance of the Bois Valise within the artist's oeuvre has increased considerably. It is no longer regarded as a mere collection of reproductions having little more than documentary value, but rather as a unique and important work of art in its own right. Moreover, it has been increasingly apparent that Duchamp's use of replication and appropriation to undercut accepted notions of originality and authenticity was hugely important to subsequent generations of artists, including the Fluxus group, which responded enthusiastically to the ideas behind the Bois Valise in their own Flux kits, many of which are now in the collection of the Hood Museum of Art. And here's two that are in the collection. And we had a wonderful exhibition last year that just won the International Art Critics Association Award for Best College or University Museum Exhibition. Very nice. In many respects, it was the Fluxus group that carried the legacy of the box in a valise into the future. And in different ways and varying degrees, contemporary artists working today have continued to build upon the conceptual strategies that Duchamp so neatly and brilliantly packed into his portable museum. Thank you. I told you I'd speak for 40 minutes. That was exactly 40 minutes. So we'll have the lights up, and maybe we've got 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll go get a glass of wine. Yeah, there's a question. Esme?
I understand that him thinking, I don't know if he's really understand the process, but you mean to say he was doing the same thing with reproductions like with the Mona Lisa and the Cezanne, and so then he was painting on a black and white photograph of him and using memory and notes to get the colors. That is, to me, that's incredibly interesting, especially though, with the Benjamin article, which I read quite a while ago, the idea of the camera as a filter, and then bringing memory back into the, and the artist's point of view back into the whole thing.
I think so too. I mean, Malraux is often cited in connection with the Bois Valise, but I think what a lot of scholars have not thought about is just how precise these reproductions were. I think Duchamp really saw the challenge was, it's not about the aura, it's about what do you do when you're in an image-saturated culture, but the images are not as good as the originals. He wanted to make a Mona Lisa that was as good as the Mona Lisa. And then he writes Elle a chaud de cou at the bottom in letters, L-H-O-O-Q, which if you sound it out in French, Elle a chaud de cou means she has a hot ass. So he's both kind of undercutting tradition. He's like, why do artists love this piece? You shouldn't be looking at Leonardo anymore. But then again, he's taking it very seriously. He took very seriously the kind of liminal space, what he called the enfremence between the original and the copy. And I think that's what challenged Benjamin. And it's clear from that quote, I think, that Benjamin sort of saw this. This is kind of amazing what he did. How do you make a reproduction that's beautiful? It should be ugly.
Benjamin.
Yeah. Kind of on a little bit different note, like how I find it like really curious that when the large glass piece being stripped bare by her fiance.
Perfectionist, yes.
Sorry. When that broke, and with his kind of he has such attention to recreation or the facsimile. Why didn't he remake? Like I find it really curious why he didn't remake it either from scratch from all of those notes as a copy, as a replica, and then but instead glued it all back together and kind of completely changed it.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I've thought about that a lot.
I think if the large glass had broken in 1918. Oh, sorry. So the question is about the recreation of the large glass, and why didn't he just make another one? He's so interested in the copy, and he absolutely had that option. He had all of the drawings and all of the notes that he then obsessively recreates. I don't really have a good answer to that. I mean, I think in a way that would have been a more complicated project. He would have had to have gone out and got all of those, because he doesn't do things in half measures. Picasso could have painted the Bride Stripped Bare in about 2 days. Duchamp takes 11 years. It's obsessive. But yeah, I think in 1918 he would have either said, "Fine, that's the status of a work of art. It's chance. It's destroyed. Throw it away." But something changed in him in that mid-30s moment that was making him think about reproduction. And in a way, I wonder if it was, had he made a copy, as he did with the ready-mades. The ready-mades were always being thrown away. People didn't know what they were. I don't know. I feel like he starts to think about posterity. And that's something that I think a lot of people who admire Duchamp don't want to think about, because they want Picasso to be this artist genius who's thinking about his reputation. But I think in a funny way Duchamp did too. He did not destroy the large glass. He repaired it. That's a very different thing. So you're picking up on something that's thorny. Yeah. It's a very interesting question. He was sort of a Larry Gagosian. He became an art dealer, and we know that the Valise was incredibly expensive. But one of the things that he'd done was he was a friend of Brancusi, and he sort of became Brancusi's agent. And the Brancusis that are in American museums were often sold by Duchamp. Duchamp was the intermediary. He had all of the connections in the art world. People like Walter Arensberg and Catherine Dry and Alfred Barr, they were forming great museum collections, and you needed a great Brancusi. Duchamp was the intermediary, and he had a cut, and that cut paid for this. Duchamp did not work a day in his life, but he found ways to do this. And again, it's interesting because no one likes to think of him as a dealer, but he sort of was. But he wasn't the dealer in the sense of driving a Mercedes-Benz and going on jets. He was really someone who funneled all the money that he would make back into these projects, which were incredibly. He had full time for 3 years at the very height of this, which I see from 1937 to 1940. When the Nazis invade, it's a real problem. He's got to get out. But he had full time, about 6 workers in this pochoir factory. I mean, they had never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
What do you think Duchamp thought the function of the museum was? I mean, I'm also thinking about the way pop art appropriated some of his ideas about rainbow. What do you think?
Well, I think so. The question is, what did Duchamp think about museums? I think that he thought that they could have been far more radical. I think this is where he's akin to Malraux, is that surely in the age of replication and reproduction, your displays can change. Why do you have to have the national schools together? That to him was a travesty. I've written a paper on how his design for the 1938 Surrealist exhibition in Paris was a parody of the things that were happening in Germany. You had in '37 the Degenerate Art Show, but you also had these exhibitions of official German art. So in other words, you went to the Degenerate Art Show and you laughed at all these grotesqueries of modern art, and then you went and saw Brecker and all the official German artists who of course were making the most insipid crap. And Duchamp parodies that in Paris. So he was certainly aware of this change in the museum, where prior to the 1930s, there was really not a great deal of interest in modern art. All of a sudden, museums are now collecting it. But what they have to do is, as I said, defang it a little bit. They have to sort of take the radical intentions out and show it as traditional artworks. If they really allowed these artworks to speak for themselves, it would actually bring into question their whole reason to be. And Duchamp famously said, "I doubt the word to be." He was a doubter. He wanted to question everything. Why do we paint with oil on canvas? Can't you make a painting on glass? And why do we use oil paints? Why can't we use dust? He famously let dust settle on the glass, and then he collects it and he puts varnish and it creates a lovely yellow color. I mean, all of his life is about that. He saw the artist really as shifting from the 19th century notion of an artist who wore a cape and it was all in the all in the wrist. It was like, and he wanted to be, the art was in the mind. So he said, cut off your hands. That was his advice to artists. I don't think we say that here. Any other questions? Yeah.
If this is true, do you care to comment on how chess replaced art for Duchamp?
Duchamp was a very great chess player. He represented France in the Olympic Games. And what he said was he came to chess too late. I think if he'd had his druthers, he would have been a chess player from the beginning. But he really starts around 1918 to play seriously every day, correspondence chess. But you may know this. He had a very young follower who used to go to his studio every day and take lessons with him, and that man was Bobby Fischer. And if you look at the Fischer games, Duchamp's often in the audience. So yeah, chess was something that had to appeal to him, because he's all about endgame strategy. This is nothing but endgame strategy for him.
I think there was another question in there too, yeah.
I remember hearing that Duchamp said that when the great glass broke, that it was the perfect finish for it, that it was lacking something until that moment. Was that a kind of acceptance, a rueful acceptance of the way the breakage hurt his own gesture of originality with the amount of time he spent on creating it?
Well, I have a couple of ways of answering that, and it's a very good question. We do know that it took Catherine Dreyer 4 years to tell him, and she finally tells him over dinner in Lyon. And both of them, in their kind of interviews or memoirs, claim that Duchamp was happy. Now, part of it was he didn't have to keep working on it. This area is not completed. There was going to be a boxing match. There was the Juggler of Gravity, and this whole section, was never completed. And what he said, and you're right about that quote, but there's a little bit at the end. He said what completed it was the symmetry of the cracks, because the panes were lying flat one on top of the other. I went too far. They kind of go like this. They start at the top and then they kind of go round. And so he sort of felt that suddenly the bride and the bachelors were sort of connected through this breakage. It's almost like her orgasm broke the whole thing. But, all right, we'll take that.
I'd be very interested to know how you first got started on being a Duchamp scholar and what initially attracted you to him, and then how it kind of went from there.
Well, I wrote my master's thesis on Richard Hamilton, the English pop artist who just died and was a great mentor to me. And after I finished it, I said to him, "So Richard, you know, I'm thinking about a PhD and I wanted to get your advice." And he said, "Do it on Duchamp. Absolutely do it on Duchamp." And he had a great archive. He had a box in a Valise. The first time I opened a box in Valise was at his house in Oxford. And it blew my mind. And, you know, he owned some of the green box notes, the white box notes. So that whole kind of notion of ephemerality was something I was very interested in. And Hamilton has another take on all of this because he kind of comes from the industrial design side. And he was very interested in the mechanics of this, of the precision of all this, which he interjected into pop art. But yeah, it was really through Hamilton. I had admired Duchamp. I kind of thought, though, that it had probably all been done. And that is my one advice to any student here. It is never done. When you scratch the surface, it's all waiting to be done. The writings on Picasso and Matisse and all of these great artists of the 20th century has barely started. If you think about someone like Masaccio, I mean, it's almost like saying, so in the 15th century, we did it all. Don't look at him again. And think about how the changes have happened over the course of the centuries of people writing on great artists. So it's barely started. That's my only advice to you. We have one more question, right? Who's going to be brave? Okay.
As you put up these images of the box on Valise, I can't help but think how much they look like a portable altar. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about whether we know anything about Duchamp's intention for how one should look at this. Should it be set up like a mini museum and stared at that way, or should it be spread out as you have in this photograph? Did he have any thoughts on that?
He definitely wanted it spread out. And in fact, the photograph I showed of him at the beginning is him demonstrating how you have to, basically you open the lid and this piece folds up. So you have the beginning and then you pull out, these are wings that kind of pull out. And then you're supposed to rearrange the contents however you want, but you're not supposed to leave them in the box. Now, the interesting thing is that you can never show all of the works reproduced. So you're almost bound to have to change the display if you want to see what's underneath. But he did not want it compressed. And many museums, when they show this, they put it in a case like this. And you lose the fact that it does have this wonderful free-spirited nature. So upstairs you'll see I installed it in the round. Now, as for an altar, that's an interesting thing because, you know, the large glass has often been read, you know, through as a kind of travesty, I guess, of religious iconography, especially Titian and these apparition of the Virgin images, or apotheosis of the Virgin. I'm not sure about that. I think what he really wanted to do was to give the sense of a museum. These are sort of walls. If you look at how these are hanging, but you have to remember, no museum at this time would show his work. I mean, MoMA was showing Cézanne and Van Gogh. They were not showing Duchamp yet. It would really be Kynaston McShine, a Dartmouth graduate, a really wonderful curator at MoMA who was the first curator there to get them interested in Duchamp. That was in the late 60s with the information show. So there you go. It can be anything you want it to be, but it's a great work of art. Thank you very much.